Diseases of the nervous system can run the gamut from mild to deadly, those of the eyes from irritating to causing blindness. The nervous system controls all body activities, both conscious and unconscious. It's a closed system, so there is no normal flora in the nervous system. The portals of entry would be breaks in the bones of the skull or the vertebra, or breaks in the meninges. Some organisms, particularly viruses, can travel via axonal transport. You will remember that some neurotransmitters are removed from the synapse by reuptake. The neurotransmitter then moves up the axon back to the cell body, where it is reprocessed to become a neurotransmitter again. Viruses can use this same route to gain deeper entry into the nervous system. And finally, if there's any distortion of the blood-brain barrier, viruses can cross the blood-brain barrier and get to the meninges. We'll start by looking at bacterial diseases, particularly bacterial meningitis. This is an inflammatory bacterial infection of the meninges, primarily the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. Typically, white blood cells are seen in the cerebrospinal fluid. There is a sudden high fever, intense meningeal inflammation. A swelling of the meninges blocks cerebrospinal flow, giving rise to severe headaches, nausea, vomiting, pain, and loss of various brain functions. People become disoriented and confused. If the brain tissue becomes infected, then we have encephalitis. We'll start by looking at bacterial meningitis. While a number of organisms can cause meningitis, there are 5 bacteria particularly involved in causing meningitis. Neisseria meningitidis is a gram-negative coccus. It's spread through the respiratory secretions of the infected individuals. A great many people carry Neisseria meningitidis as normal throat flora from time to time. For this to be spread person to person, it typically takes prolonged contact. This is the only one of the meningitises that becomes epidemic. It is seen particularly in college dorms and army barracks. Streptococcus pneumoniae is a gram-positive coccus. This is normal throat flora in 75% of the population. It gets into the bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier. The elderly and the very young are most susceptible to this form of meningitis. Haemophilus influenza is a gram-negative bacillus. It's actually a pretty short, fat bacillus, so it falls in the category of being a coccobacillus. This used to be the most common meningitis in childhood, children under the age of 5, but there is a vaccine and most children are now vaccinated for this, so we don't see it nearly as often. It's more common in the elderly now. This also can be normal throat flora and can be spread through respiratory secretions, but it typically is not contagious. Listeria monocytogenes is a gram-positive bacillus. This one is acquired from food, unpasteurized dairy products, deli meats, and sometimes even from fruits. This organism actually likes to live at refrigerator temperatures. This organism, if acquired by the mother, doesn't cause the mother much problem, but it crosses the placenta and the baby may be born with meningitis. Depending upon the stage of the pregnancy when the mother becomes infected, the baby may be born stillborn or may even be miscarried. Streptococcal agalactiae is another gram-positive cocci. This is usually called group B streptococcus. This one is acquired in the birth canal. Mothers can become colonized with this organism at any time, so typically moms are checked during the pregnancy to see if this organism is present, and they are treated if it's found. Survivors of group B meningitis may have permanent neurological damage. Cerebrospinal fluid taps and a gram stain are useful in diagnosing what type of meningitis someone has. Quick treatment is necessary with intravenous antibiotics. Which ones used depend upon the organism. Best prevention is interruption of transmission. There are vaccines for Streptococcus pneumoniae, Neisseria meningitidis, and Haemophilus influenza type B. These should certainly be given to anyone at risk, particularly the very old and the very young. Penicillin is administered at birth to children who are born to mothers who have a colonization with Streptococcus agalactiae. This typically prevents them from developing the disease. It is recommended that military and college students be vaccinated for Neisseria meningitidis. Pregnant women should avoid high-risk foods, unpasteurized dairy, deli meats, and certain other things in order to avoid getting Listeria monocytogenes. Hansen's disease, or leprosy, is caused by Mycobacterium leprae. This is an acid-fast bacillus. While it is a gram-positive bacillus, it does not gram stain well because of the mycolic acid in its cell wall. This disease has two basic manifestations. In tuberculoid leprosy, the individual infected has a very strong T cell population that limits the disease. There are areas of loss of sensation from nerve damage, but this disease is non-progressive. Lepromatous leprosy is the one that destroys tissue. There's severe deformities. Here, the bacteria multiplies in the skin and the mucous membranes and the nerves. The development of signs and symptoms is slow because this organism has a very long generation time. Transmission seems to be through very, very long-term contact. This organism just is not virulent. There have been many cases of people who worked with lepers for many, many years and never got the disease. Treatment is with multiple drugs. This organism quickly develops resistance to a number of drugs. There is some evidence that the BCG vaccine, which is given in other countries for tuberculosis, may offer some protection. Other preventive techniques include limiting contact and the use of prophylactic drugs for people who have been in contact with leprosy. Botulism is actually an intoxication, not an infection. It's caused by the toxin that's produced by Clostridium botulinum. This is a gram-positive bacillus that produces endospores and is anaerobic. All the clostridial species are common in the environment, particularly the dirt. There are three types of botulism. Foodborne botulism occurs when the individual ingests the toxin in contaminated food. The food will look, smell, and taste normal. Symptoms usually occur within 2 days of consumption and include blurred vision and progressive paralysis. Death is usually due to paralysis of the diaphragm. Infant botulism is typically seen in infants under 6 months of age. Here, the infant has ingested the spores in some sort of food. The organism germinates in the intestine and produces toxin. This organism becomes a major player in their intestinal flora because they don't yet have all of the gastrointestinal flora they will have as adults. There's no microbial antagonism to keep this organism at minimal numbers. These infants show failure to thrive and develop something called floppy baby syndrome. They will have been sitting up or even starting to take their first steps, and then suddenly they will become flaccid, unable to control their muscles. In wound botulism, the wound becomes infected with Clostridium botulinum instead of one of the other clostridial species that may be in the dirt. As the organism grows in the wound, it produces the toxins which spread throughout the body and give the classic symptoms. The botulism toxin is a neurotoxin. This is a toxin that affects neuron activity. It's the deadliest known toxin in the world. It's said that 30 grams of pure botulism toxin could kill the entire population of the United States. Even the smallest exposure can cause death. Simply a taste of the food or licking the spoon may kill you. The toxin binds irreversibly to the acetylcholine receptors on muscle cells. This means when acetylcholine is released at the neuromuscular junction that would tell the muscle cells to contract, they can't because there are no receptors for the acetylcholine available. The muscles then become flaccid. Because the biggest thing that happens is the airway stops working, the first treatment is to keep the airway open. In the case of an infant, they can repeatedly flush the gastrointestinal tract to try to remove the organism. The gastrointestinal tract does have to be functioning for this to work. Intravenous administration of the antitoxin can be done, and IV antibiotics can be given to kill the organism if it's in a wound. The best prevention is to destroy endospores in any food. The toxin can be destroyed by heating food to 80 degrees centigrade for at least 20 minutes. Also, because honey is the biggest source of these endospores for infants, avoid feeding honey to babies until they're at least a year old. Botulism toxin has actually been harnessed for some good. People have been using it in facials to paralyze certain facial muscles and remove wrinkles. It's also been used to treat migraine headaches and certain other chronic muscle spasm type diseases. Tetanus is also an intoxication. Here the neurotoxin is known as tetanospasmin. This is produced by Clostridium tetani, also a gram-positive bacilli that produces endospores and is anaerobic. The initial and most diagnostic sign of tetanus is the tightening of the neck and jaw muscles, giving rise to its common name of lockjaw. Endospores enter the wound. Again, clostridial spores are very common in the environment. As the organism grows, it releases toxin. Now, this particular toxin blocks the inhibition of motor neurons. When acetylcholine is released across the neuromuscular junction, muscles contract. There are also inhibitory neurons that inhibit contraction. Tetanospasmin blocks the inhibitory neurons. This means that once the muscle is contracted, it doesn't relax, so these people experience paralysis. The treatment is to debride the wound and give passive immunotherapy, tetanus antitoxin. This organism can be prevented through vaccination with the tetanus toxoid. Also, any wound should be thoroughly cleaned. There is a misconception that puncture wounds typically give rise to tetanus. Any wound that's contaminated with dirt can give rise to tetanus. Viral meningitis has symptoms similar to bacterial meningitis, but usually the symptoms are milder. Several different viruses can cause viral meningitis, but the most common viruses are the picoRNA viridae. These are small RNA viruses that can cross the blood-brain barrier. The three most common are Coxsackie A virus and Coxsackie B virus. They got their names because they were originally found in Coxsackie, New York, and then the ECHO virus. ECHO stands for Enteric Cytotoxic Human Orphan. We don't know where this virus comes from, so it's a human orphan. These are all enteroviruses. They attack the cells of the intestinal tract and lungs. It's believed they get into the blood or lymphatic system and move to the brain. Because these are cytotoxic viruses, they kill the cells. If they get to the brain, they start killing the cells of the meninges, causing the meningitis. These viruses are continuously shed in feces, so this is a contagious type disease. It has a summer-fall prevalence. The virus can even survive chlorination. A great many people carry the virus and never show any signs or symptoms of disease, so there are asymptomatic carriers. The treatment is to let this disease run its course with supportive therapy. It usually takes a week to 10 days to recover. Prevention is good hand washing, since this is transmitted through the oral fecal route, and avoiding crowded pools in the summertime. Poliomyelitis is also an enterovirus that's an RNA virus. This is acquired by ingesting the virus. It travels in the lymph and the blood to the central nervous system. About 90% of polio cases are asymptomatic infections. That is, there is no obvious paralysis. Paralytic polio occurs when the virus invades motor neurons of the spinal cord, damaging them. As a result, paralysis occurs. The neurons cannot transmit information to the muscles, therefore the muscles can't respond. If the muscles go unstimulated for too long, they will atrophy and be unable to respond later should the nerve recover. Post-polio syndrome is something we're beginning to see because we now have people who recovered from polio 30 to 40 years ago. Post-polio syndrome is a deterioration of the polio-affected muscles. It occurs in those people who had polio many years ago, so there is a delayed onset of this disease. Treatment is typically to manage the symptoms. The best treatment was some physical therapy that kept the muscles active. Should the nerves recover, the muscles were still there to respond. This is a disease that has almost been eradicated due to vaccination. Rabies is a zoonosis caused by the Rhabdoviridae. These are also RNA viruses. The virus is shed in the saliva of the infected animal. Humans acquire the disease if they're bitten by an infected animal or handle a carcass of a dead animal and get the virus into some sort of wound. Death is typically from respiratory paralysis and other neurological complications. Once the virus enters the body, it attaches to the muscle cells and replicates in the muscle cells. Eventually, it crosses the neuromuscular junction and uses retrotransport in the axon to go deeper into the nervous system. By the time symptoms occur, it is usually too late to provide any treatment, so death is a common consequence. It can be prevented. After exposure, there is a vaccine that can be given that's usually successful. People who are going to regularly handle animals typically get the vaccine ahead of time. The other prevention is to avoid possible exposure. Avoid animals that are acting strangely. Do not handle carcasses of animals unless you are adequately clothed. Arboviral encephalitis is a group of viruses that are arthropod-borne. Arbo comes from arthropod, born. There are several viral families involved. These are all zoonoses. Typically, the virus infects birds, horses, or rodents. Rarely does it infect humans. When humans do acquire the disease, it's usually mild cold-like symptoms that occur 3 to 7 days after exposure. The West Nile virus has had the most impact in the United States. Other viruses include Eastern equine encephalitis, Western equine encephalitis, St. Louis encephalitis, and California encephalitis. All of these viruses are RNA viruses. Eastern and Western equine are in the Togaviridae family. St. Louis and West Nile are Flaviviridae, and the California is a Bunyaviridae. These viruses are transmitted from animal to human by mosquitoes. Treatment is typically supportive therapy until the virus runs its course. The best prevention is controlling mosquitoes, the vector for the disease, and vaccination of animals so animals do not harbor the virus. Cryptococcal meningitis is caused by the yeast Cryptococcus neoformans, so this is a mycosis. Cryptococcus neoformans is an encapsulated yeast. This yeast is commonly found in soil and bird feces worldwide. It is inhaled, and people with a normal immune system contain the disease without ever developing any symptoms. People with AIDS and those who are immunocompromised have the disease spread in the blood where it gets into the central nervous system, causing meningitis. Treatment is with IV amphotericin B and oral 5-fluorocytosine. These are two antifungal drugs that cross the blood-brain barrier. Since this is a disease of the immunosuppressed, only hospitals and nursing homes need to be concerned about prevention. The prevention is to use devices that deter roosting around hospital and nursing homes' air intake vents. This way the yeast will not get into the air that goes into the buildings. African sleeping sickness or African trypanosomiasis is caused by Trypanosoma brucei. This is a protozoan, so this is a parasitic disease. This particular protozoa has flagella. The organism is harbored in wild and domesticated animals, and it's spread to human by the tsetse fly bite. There are two forms, a very rapidly progressive form that is found in East Africa and a more delayed form that is found in West Africa. The protozoa is introduced to the blood by the tsetse fly bite. The organism will then replicate in the blood for a while before it goes to the brain tissue. In the brain, it begins to damage the brain tissue, and these individuals eventually go into a coma and die. You can treat this with antiparasitics that cross the blood-brain barrier. Melarsoprol and eflornithine are two of the drugs that can be used to treat this disease. These drugs have to be administered very quickly after exposure to the disease, and this seldom happens because this disease occurs in very, very poor parts of Africa where health care is quite poor. Prevention would include controlling the tsetse fly. Widespread use of pesticides is not really practical and would do considerable amounts of damage to the environment. So netting over beds and window screens and keeping skin covered with clothing to prevent the bites is the most common avenue used in this country. Primary amebic meningoencephalopathy is caused by two amoeba, Acanthamoeba and Naegleria. These are very common free-living inhabitants in warm environmental waters and moist soil. They enter through cuts or scrapes in the skin or abrasions of the conjunctiva. You can also get this by inhaling contaminated water. These amoeba travel to the brain via the cranial nerves. It can be treated with fluconazole or amphotericin B early on. Prevention is very difficult. The amoeba produce cysts that allow them to survive in the water even in adverse weather conditions. Probably the best prevention is to avoid swimming in natural waterways. Prion disease is transmitted using an infectious protein, or a prion. Scrapie and mad cow disease were seen in animals. These were spongiform encephalopathies. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was a spongiform encephalopathy seen in humans that was a genetic type of dementia. Prion disease made the jump from cattle to humans a few years ago, and we developed a variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. We still get spongiform encephalopathy, but this disease progresses very rapidly. Within a year or two, the individual is dead. Prions are highly indestructible. They may remain dormant for as long as 60 years. They have been transmitted through medical procedures and the use of instruments that, even though they were adequately sterilized for most things, did not kill prions. The variant seems to be acquired through eating contaminated meat. There is no treatment available. The best prevention is to remain prion-free, not eating infected meat. Trachoma is the leading cause of non-traumatic blindness. This is caused by a chlamydia, Chlamydia trachomatis. Chlamydia are obligate intracellular parasites. They damage the cell in which they live. In children, this disease is typically acquired through the birth canal. Chlamydia is a common venereal disease. It can cause blindness in adults who auto-infect, that is, they have a genital form of chlamydia and they manage to get it to their eyes. Chlamydia is susceptible to antibiotics. Pregnant women with chlamydia should be aggressively treated, and in infants who are born to mothers who have chlamydia, they can have antimicrobial creams rubbed into their eyes. Other eye infections include conjunctivitis, sometimes called pink eye. This is an inflammation of the conjunctiva. Haemophilus influenza is the most common bacterial cause of true pink eye. Here there is quite a bit of pus and mattering of the eye, and the eye gets quite red. Any normal skin flora can be rubbed into the eye, so Staphylococcus can cause this disease. Neisseria gonorrhea can be transmitted to an infant that comes through the birth canal of a mother who has gonorrhea. This causes ophthalmia neonatorum. This needs to be treated aggressively and early because it can cause blindness. Because the eye is connected to the nasal passages via the tear duct, almost anything that irritates the nasal passages or infects the nasal passages can creep up the nasal passages, so all kinds of viruses and other bacteria can cause conjunctivitis. Keratitis is an inflammation of the cornea. This is most commonly caused by acanthamoeba. Yes, this is the same organism that can cause meningoencephalitis. All conjunctivitis and keratitis is typically treated with topical ointments aimed at destroying whichever organism is causing the disease.